mentioned before, follow-up testing. Hold on. Okay, follow-up testing reminder. They do the education, how it affects the body, nutrition, and record keeping. Okay, so that's a very quick rundown of the program as a whole. Now we'll get into kind of lead, what it is, why it's important, and how it affects children. So, many people just have this notion that in order for a child to be lead poisoned, they need to be taking it in by the handfuls. And that's unfortunately it's not true. It just takes a few specks, a few granules to poison a child. A perfect visual for this is, imagine a sugar packet. And if that sugar packet is spread equally over this entire football field, and then you take 1 square foot, that's still going to be too much lead to poison a child. So, just a granule or two, if that sugar were lead dust, it does not take much to poison a child. It is a real threat, and it's unfortunately not a thing of the past. Yes, lead was banned from many things, in the 70s and even in the 90s, but it doesn't go away. It doesn't just magically disappear. It hangs on. So it is a threat. When I refer to an EBL, or like I said, an elevated blood lead level, the numerical value is a 5. So 5 micrograms per deciliter is considered elevated. All right. Lead and health. Lead does not naturally occur in the body, and it primarily enters through either inhalation or ingestion. So you can breathe it in, or you can consume it and eat it in the form, on lead dust. It connects to dust, and just remember, if you picture those sugar granules, and you can breathe it in, or you can end up consuming it, and you can end up poisoning yourself. It is considered a poison with toxic effects, especially to the neurological, cognitive, behavioral, and just about every other body system. The harmful effects cannot be reversed, and they can carry into adulthood. So lead also crosses the placental barrier and can pass into breast milk. One key fact to kind of keep in mind when you're dealing with lead poisoning is how it's stored in the body. So if you have lead, it's stored in your blood for days, it's stored in your tissues for months, and it can be stored in your bones for decades. And that's relevant because, say a little girl has an elevated lead level, and 20, 30 years down the road, she becomes pregnant. And if she's calcium deficient, that fetus is going to take what it needs from the mother, right? Some mothers, their oral health suffers when they're pregnant because the baby is taking the calcium from the mother, and the teeth end up getting infected. But at the same time, if that mother has lead stored in her bones, that baby can end up absorbing lead from the mother. So, there's that generational cycle there. And it doesn't happen too frequently, but we have seen babies born with elevated lead levels. So let's see. So, lead does affect us over our entire lifespan. It is true that it primarily affects children, young children, but it can affect anyone. During pregnancy, it can pass from the mother to the child, and also through breastfeeding. Just think of children and all their hand and mouth behaviors and what they ingest and inhale, and they have a much faster metabolism. And then adults can also be exposed through occupational and different hobbies. So, about 99% of the amount of lead taken into the body of an adult will leave as waste within a few weeks. But only about 32% of lead taken into the body of a child will leave as waste. So how much is absorbed is affected by the person's iron and calcium status. Children absorb much more because their respiratory rate is faster than adults. Their neurosystem is developing rapidly, especially when under the age of 6, and even more so under the age of 3. They are also much closer to the ground, so the dust that's stirred up is most concentrated in their breathing space. They have much more hand and mouth activities, and they have a lot of oral exploration of the world in their oral habits of sucking on their fingers or hands, and pretty much So, to mention, children under the age of 3 are most likely to be susceptible to lead poisoning. Just everything is working against them. Their higher breathing rates, metabolism, and they explore the world through their mouths. So, just remember, a tiny amount of lead can cause the harmful effects. Lead dust can be introduced to floors from people walking on them after walking across bare soil that's contaminated. Wind blowing in an open window, or from a work area with lead sources, or even from paint, dusting, peeling, or flaking from the walls or ceiling. It can happen. Let's see. Lead is considered a cumulative toxicant that affects multiple body systems, including the neurologic, hematologic, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, and renal systems. Chronic exposure often causes hematological effects, such as anemia, or neurological disturbances, such as headache, irritability, lethargy, convulsions, tremors. Acute exposures may cause GI disturbances, hepatic and renal damage, hypertension, and neurological effects that can eventually lead to convulsions and death. Thankfully, almost nobody dies from lead poisoning anymore, especially in this country, but it can happen. The last time that it happened in this country was, I believe, about 15 years ago. There was a case in Minnesota. A young child was brought to the emergency department by his parents, flu-like symptoms, and they actually did a KUB, an abdominal X-ray, and saw an object in his digestive tract, but they didn't think too much of it, and he was sent home. And then a few days later, he returned to the hospital, and this time he was convulsing, and he eventually passed away from acute lead toxicity. What it was determined later on was that he had swallowed a little Reebok charm from a sneaker, just a little metallic charm he swallowed. And it was so highly concentrated in lead that young child unfortunately passed away. So yeah, that it shouldn't happen, but it can. That the possibility is always there. Let's see. Children, they are particularly vulnerable to the neurotoxic effects of lead, and even low levels of exposure can cause adverse neurocognitive effects, including poor academic performance and behavioral problems that in some cases may be irreversible. There is no safe blood lead level identified. So, and then the recent evidence actually suggests that the dose effect relationship shows a steeper dose response and a potential risk for an adverse health effect, such as IQ loss, at lead levels less than 10 as compared to those higher than 10. So even though you may have a lower lead level, in that like 5 to 9 range, where it's considered elevated but still kind of low, it can still adversely affect your IQ even more so than the higher lead levels. So let's see here. Okay, so the neurological system is by far the hardest hit in terms of lead. However, most children with elevated lead levels rarely act or even look sick, even at the levels of 45 or higher that require chelation therapy. The first noticed neurological symptoms often is seizure activity at levels of 70 or higher, and that's a sign of brain swelling, and it's never a good outcome. So that's not what we want to see. Thankfully, we almost never see it, but we do see a handful of cases that high every year in the state of Missouri. So, though it's pretty rare, a child may not be able to be saved if the lead level gets that high. So, on average, we get about a dozen children a year throughout the state that end up needing chelation therapy at a children's hospital. So. I mentioned how lead can affect IQ. Oops. There we go. I'm just trying to get that. Okay. And so let's say, for example, the average IQ is 100. And in a population of 100 million, that would leave us with 6 million in the mentally retarded category, the MR, and 6 million considered gifted. Well, and if that lead exposure just causes the shift of 5 IQ points, to you and I, that may not make or break us, in life. But at a population level for public health, overall, those 5 points are pretty significant. You shift that IQ 5 points, and look how many less individuals are considered gifted and how many more fall into that MR category. That's pretty staggering. So, just think of just the economic consequences of all that and the social consequences. So, yeah, as far as public health, lead prevention goes a long way. There we go. Okay. So, what are the healthcare provider responsibilities? Well, first and foremost, at the well checks and testing, that lead risk questionnaire should always be performed. Usually, it's a series of questions that are asked. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And that also acts as an educational piece. There are high-risk areas in the state. I will show you the map. So certain areas of the state need to be tested more frequently. And then there's also Medicaid children. It's a federal requirement that children enrolled in Medicaid need to be tested, lead tested at age 1 and 2 at a minimum. And then there's the clinical follow-up. Evaluation, nutritional supplements, making sure they're not anemic and providing iron if it's called for. At the higher levels of chelation and hospitalization, and then ongoing monitoring of their growth and development. I'm just trying to get that. This is the problem with my tiny little screen. Okay, but yeah, making referrals as needed, whether it's first steps or Head Start, those types of things. This is just, okay. So a lot of times it's like, well, I don't know who should be tested. When do the children need to be tested? And it can get kind of confusing. So this is a little more formal. There's a lead risk map, as I mentioned, and there's some areas of the state considered high risk and some that are considered general risk. Children that live in high risk areas should be tested annually. I'm just skimming through this. We'll break it down here in a minute. Lead risk questionnaire should be completed at all well child checks between the ages of 6 months to 72 months. And any positive results should prompt a lead test with physician's discretion. And then, as I mentioned, all Medicaid children at 12 and 24 months are required to get a lead test. Oops. Okay. I tried to make it a little more straightforward here. Okay, so, as mentioned, there's a questionnaire that should be performed at all well checks up to the age of 72 months. And if there's a positive response, or even possibly if the family doesn't know, if they don't know how their home is, then a capillary or a venous lead test should be performed. If if a child is enrolled in Medicaid, it is a federal requirement at 12 and 24 months to receive a lead test, regardless of their response to the questionnaire. And then every child under the age of 6 who lives in or visits 10 or more hours a week in a high risk area should be tested annually. And so this is a copy of the map. If you're not familiar with it, I believe it should be found on our website, or we can also send you a copy. And several factors were taken into consideration when.
Cathy.
Yeah. Yes.
We have a quick question from the chat that goes back to your previous slide.
Mm-hmm.
Beth Dauber's asking, if someone was exposed as a child but was not tested, could they be tested as an adult, and would it show they were exposed early in life?
That is a great question. Anyone should be able to be tested, upon request. However, if you are now an adult and you wanted to get a lead test, if you are not currently being exposed to lead, you likely would not have an elevated blood lead test because, think back to how lead is stored. It's in your blood for days, tissues for months, and bones for decades, right? So the lead is only in your blood for a short amount of time. So when you have an elevated blood lead levels, the blood test, that's indicative of a recent exposure. Um, so typically, you don't really know for sure if you were exposed as a child. If well, yeah, you should always be free to request a lead test. A physician, hopefully they wouldn't deny your request. They are very inexpensive. Of course, there are some physicians who would be like, no, that's unnecessary. Some public health departments may be willing to provide a lead test, especially pregnant women should always be considered for a lead test as well. But yes, long story short, yes, it would not. The current blood test wouldn't. All right, excellent. All right. Okay. Yeah. So several factors were considered in developing this map. Looked at the current elevated blood lead rate, the testing rate, the quantity of pre-1980 housing, and that's because in 1972 is when lead was banned from paint. So lead paint. And the older the paint, the more likely that the condition is deteriorating and it's becoming a hazard. So 1980 was considered the no, yeah. And then also if there's occupational exposure risk in certain counties, and then if it's they have Superfund sites. So if anyone desires, we could talk more in depth on that. But long story short, this is the map. This particular map is considered a map or is considered a draft because we are in the process of updating our regulations. COVID, of course, has been the monkey wrench in all of it. So it's been a dragged out process. But this is the map that we are going off of, even though it's not yet in regulation. So if a county is in the red, they are considered a high-risk county for lead. And if a child lives in or spends 10 or more hours a week in a high-risk county, they should receive a lead test every year up until the age of 6. If a child lives in a general risk county, they should at least be screened using a questionnaire annually up to the age of 6, and then tested appropriately given their responses to the questionnaire. So this doesn't take into consideration Medicaid status at all. If a child is on Medicaid, regardless of where they live, they need to be lead tested at 12 and 24 months at a minimum. So this is the questionnaire I've been referring to. This is the formal one that I believe the Medicaid mandates that's used. It's a joint form between us at the Department of Health and the Department of Social Services. Its official name is the HCY Lead Risk Assessment Guide. It stands for Healthy Children and Youth. These are the questions. I know for me personally at my children's pediatrician's office, just the nurse rooming us in, she just kind of runs down them, now she just says any lead concerns and nope. But yeah, does the child have any siblings or playmates with lead poisoning? Do they live in or regularly visit a home or daycare built before 1950? And you may recall on the previous slide, I was talking about 1980. Well, this is an older form. In 1950 was the previous year considered to be the most at risk. So anyways, this doesn't have to be the exact form used, but just some variation of these questions are what should be asked. Okay, given all this, many people would think, well, at this point, isn't lead testing in children routine? And unfortunately, no, it is not. Using 2019 data, Less than 19% of Missouri children under the age of 72 months even received a lead test. And roughly 25% of the 12 and 24-month-old children enrolled in Medicaid even received a lead test. And remember, that's a federal requirement. So that, only a quarter of them are receiving a lead test. And then in some counties, testing is as low as 7%. So, it's important that we fill in the gaps. We hear frequently that, lead's not a problem. Lead's not a problem in my area. Don't need to worry about it. And, hopefully that is the case. But lead may not be a problem in your area just because the children aren't being tested. And if you recall, lead poisoned children may look and act fine. It's not till down the road that the neurological consequences and other consequences can become evident. So, yes, always run a lead test. When in doubt, just test for lead. Okay. So, where are we going? Okay. Yeah, there are, I mentioned the risk assessors in the area that go to the home and look for the source of lead. They typically will go to the primary residence of the family. But if they were unsuccessful in finding any source of lead, they may go to secondary residences where the child spends a lot of time. And then also they can help with linkages to services as well, such as First Steps, community action centers. Children with a venous blood lead level of 10 or greater typically will qualify for a lead risk assessment. At that point, it's only optional. A lead risk assessment actually becomes mandatory, legally required, when a child has a single venous 20 or the child has two venous 15s at least 3 months apart. So, but yeah, we have several risk assessors that have different regions. And then the areas in the gray, we actually refer to them as gray counties. So the Kansas City area, St. Louis area, Greene County, Jasper County, Jefferson County, they run their own lead programs and they have their own risk assessors. So they kind of do their own thing, but they still follow state statutes. Now, getting to just different lead sources, that's another thing is, well, where can we be exposed to lead? You can be exposed to lead in a lot of places. Far and away, the most common source is older housing, the lead paint. Lead paint in and of itself isn't always a bad thing. If it's in good condition, it's not bad. But as it deteriorates, as it starts chipping, flaking, peeling, that's when it's hazardous. So, a lot of times people hear, well, I grew up with lead paint and I turned out just fine. And, that's great. And hopefully that's the case. But 30, 40, 50 years ago, that lead paint on that house was in much better condition than it is now. Oftentimes our risk assessors see paint kind of in this condition. Let me move that out of the way. There we go. That typical alligator chipping. That's when it becomes hazardous. So there also is occupational exposures, battery manufacturing, recycling. There's also lead mining and smelting. The state of Missouri, we are pretty unique in that not only are we the largest producer of lead in the country, we're also one of the largest producers of lead in the entire world. I'm not sure if that's a bragging point, but it's a fact. So we do see an awful lot of occupational exposure, which can result in take-home exposure, and that is how many of the children end up getting poisoned in the state as well. Because of our history of mining, if there's a lot of lead in the soil in certain areas of the state, it can be found in water. Everyone probably recalls Flint, Michigan, and their issue. Lead is not typically found in water, but it's always checked for at our risk assessments. But lead can also be in toys, older toys, at grandma's house. Also, the cheaper toys, maybe from the dollar store or whatever, they can also have lead. Certain spices, ethnic spices and cosmetics and jewelry, they can have lead. One There was a case in Kansas City, Kansas, a couple years ago. An entire family ended up being lead poisoned, um, and couldn't figure out where the source was. Uh, Another, long story short, the family was buying their spices from the local ethnic store, and well, you when you're buying spices in bulk, you pay by weight, right? Well, the shop was actually adding lead to the spices to increase the weight, um, and therefore increase the price that they could sell them for. And so an entire family, from the baby and children to the mother and father, all had elevated lead levels. So stranger things have happened. um, a lot of cosmetics and jewelry and other time, certain cultures, put the eyeliner on the children. Those frequently may have lead in them. Keys are another common source of lead. Car keys, house keys. That's a huge no-no, and so many people, including people in my own family, are guilty of it. You're in the checkout line at the grocery store, and you're just trying to occupy your child for a few minutes, and you just, here, take my keys, and let them play. And what little toddler is not, you know, just taken aback by keys? They're fun, right? Well, they almost always have lead, so that's something a child should never be playing with, and especially putting in their mouth. Um, Ammunition, reloading your own ammo, that could be a source of lead. Fishing sinkers are frequently lead, and then also stained glass making. These are some of the most common sources. Let's see here. Mhm. And then, so if we find out that a child has an elevated lead level, there are things that can be done, referrals that can be made. Frequently Head Starts and daycare. Oh, sorry, I'm getting confused on which slide I'm on. Okay, yeah. I'm going to back up. All right. So, one thing that we want to do, especially to increase and promote lead testing to hopefully get in front of children having higher lead levels, is encourage testing and adding lead testing results and history of elevations to health forms. Head Starts have a requirement to have lead testing every year. They're typically pretty good about it. Daycares, it's currently in statute that daycares located in the high risk counties are required to have proof of lead testing upon entry, but a child can't be denied if the parent refuses. That's not something that's typically enforced, but yeah. And then also upon school entry, entering kindergarten, getting the record of if a child has an elevated lead level. And that's important, because yes, when a child's entering school, and they're 5, maybe 6, they're getting towards the end of the high risk time for lead exposure. So that's not exactly when we want to be starting to reach out for lead poisoning. But if the knowledge of a history of lead exposure is known, that could be beneficial, because remember, the neurological effects and the ADHD. Children make special. They should have special milestones, meeting special milestones, especially at first, fourth, and sixth or seventh grades. And oftentimes the child may just be given the benefit of the doubt. Oh, let's give them a little more time. They're just not quite getting it yet. However, if the history of elevated lead levels is known in this child, that should qualify them for special services sooner, and any early intervention that you can get, better, right? So let's see. Okay. Oh, I flew through that pretty quick. I could probably talk on and on about it. Before I totally stop, I do want to tell you guys about one other source of lead that we found about 2 years back, a very unusual case, just to kind of highlight how I don't know how lead really can be found anywhere. There's this picture of this birthday cake here, right? And that was a cake, a real cake made by a mother here in Missouri 2 years ago. The child, they weren't on Medicaid. At the 1 year well check, had a lead test, and it wasn't super high, but it was elevated. It was around an 8 or 9. The home was in immaculate condition. It was a newer home. Couldn't figure out where the source of lead was coming from. Well, on a whim, the mother and the risk assessor who was at the home, they're like, well, let's test different, spices and cooking supplies, whatever. Well, the mother had recently made this first birthday cake for her daughter, and she used a product called sunflower sugar art. So it was like a powder that you added to the frosting or the icing to give it some color. Well, that ended up testing at 33% lead. So a third of that was leaded. And that was a product made here in America, in Florida, modern day, current times. So, so it can happen. It shouldn't happen, but it can. A mother inadvertently poisoned her child making a birthday cake using a product that one would think would be for food. It's marketed towards cake decorating. The kicker there was that it stated non-toxic, but it didn't say that it was for consumption. That's currently up with the FDA somewhere. But yeah, there was another case in Springfield just a few years ago, a 3-year-old child, and many physicians don't continue to test children after the age of 2. But this child was not on Medicaid, 3 years old. Mother wanted to have this child tested for lead, and the doctor was like, I don't think it's necessary, whatever. But okay, sure, if you insist. Well, that child they did the capillary test in the office, and it came back as a result of high. It didn't even give a numerical value. And on a lead care analyzer, the point of care device, that indicates it's 65 or higher. So that's pretty high. If it's an accurate result, you have to go to Cardinal Glennon or St. Louis Children's or Children's Mercy and get some chelation therapy. The result ended up coming back at like 75, Venus 75. So that child had a dangerously high lead level. What ended up being the exposure and why this mother requested a lead test is because this child was chewing on the windowsill. And when the mother asked him why he was doing that, he stated, well, it tastes like frosting, or it tastes like icing. And so she went to Dr. Google. She Googled it and learned, hey, lead has a sweet taste, which is true. Lead does taste very sweet. So when those little kids happen to consume or get some lead paint in their mouth, they like it. It tastes good to them. This was actually a marketing technique a long time ago, I believe by Dutch boy. I don't know, probably in the 30s or 40s, something like that. It is sweet tasting. But yeah, this child was chewing on the windowsill because it tasted good to them and it felt good in their mouth. And he poisoned himself. And here we are, I think 3 years later, his lead level is still elevated, but still coming down. So it can happen when we hear a lot of children chewing on things that they shouldn't be chewing on, especially children with different pica behaviors. Autism, children with autism or autistic children, they frequently have pica characteristics, and some of our more recent chelation cases have been children with autism. So anyways, I could go on and on about different cases, but that, as I mentioned, is pretty much all I have. And as I said before, I'm Cathy Wood, who work for the state health department. All right, I guess.